everyone, and welcome to the last day of our Diversity in Data conference, co-hosted by the BCS Data Management Specialist Group and the BCS Women's Specialist Group and DAMA UK. Hopefully you've been able to dial into some of our sessions already this week. We've heard from a great range of speakers talking through AI, analytics, data pathways, with a diverse point of view. And today we're going to hear from our final speaker of the week, which is Lisa Allen from the Open Data Institute, who's going to talk to us about data beyond bias and addressing diversity challenges. And after Lisa's talk today, we have a final panel this afternoon talking about data in diversity and inclusion and giving you some reflections on some of the topics that we've talked about this week. So with that, I will hand over to Lisa, who's going to talk us through her presentation, and then we'll have the opportunity at the end to ask some questions. Lisa, over to you.
Perfect, thank you. Hi, everybody. So I'm Lisa Allen. I'm Director of Data and Tech Services at the ODI. And I'm also Vice Chair of DAMA UK. So I'm really passionate about data standards and about the data profession. So I'm a data professional with many years experience in data across the public sector and now helping other organisations. So I've done things like release environment agency data, like 2,000 data sets in 1 year as part of a Secretary of State challenge. I've implemented GDPR. I've developed data maturity models, fed into the government's data quality framework, and co-written a book called The Little Book of Data on Implementing Data Transformations. So I've been in this space for quite a while. And I think DE&I has been close to my heart for many years, because personally from suffering from harassment at work in my early career to discrimination for jobs. So in one interview, I was actually told that I didn't get the job because men swear. So I thought that was quite interesting, because at the time I swore like a navvy. I was terrible. But I was also really active in the Environment Agency's Women's Network, where I led on leadership. We came up with like an anonymous blog that helped surface the topics that people were too scared to talk about at the time. I also sponsored the DE&I work at Ordnance Survey originally, and also ODI. And I have a son with a disability. So I'm really interested in the diversity challenges we have and the biases in the data collection, use and sharing. So we're going to go through some of those biases and some of those examples, and then I'm going to talk you through some of how the responsible practices can help solve them. So if I start going through now, so if I just start with who's the ODI. So for those of you who've not heard of the Open Data Institute, we're a London-based not-for-profit organisation with a global reach. So we're mission-driven. That means we want a world where data works for everybody. And we were set up 10 years ago now by Sir Tim Berners-Lee and Sir Nigel Shadbolt. And we focus our efforts on 3 broad areas. And those areas are improving data practices of the organisations. So we can help them build and manage data infrastructure for data use. So some of the things we've done, like Trustworthy Data Stewardship Guidebook, or the Data Sharing Risk Assessment Guide we've got out there, or our training on data ethics professionals. The second thing we do is tackle challenges so the data ecosystem works well. So on data standards to help that flow of data. And I've got one of those examples today here. And the last thing we can do is about gathering and creating research and the evidence and knowledge about the data. So really looking about what's coming over the horizon and how that impacts the data world. So this is our strategy. We just launched it recently. So and it talks about 6 principles that we look to. So of those 6 principles, you'll see them in the pink box. We really talk about strong data infrastructure. So we believe that data is like your roads or your railways. It needs to be considered as infrastructure and treated in that way. We want open data as the foundation of it, because actually there's less friction and it helps support across the ecosystem. We believe that trust in data and those who create it is really important. And that leads on to the next one about needing independent bodies in the ecosystems that can really help put that trust in that system. And then it's great to see that we want to make sure we're reducing harms through diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it's a real core thing. So it's really at the heart of what we do is in our strategy is D&I. And the last one is about the need for skills and knowledge. So that gives you a bit of a flavour of some of the strategic objective of the Open Data Institute. So we talk about, this is our data spectrum. So we talk about data from closed through to shared through to open. And it's quite interesting when you're considering actually the data that's just been used by ChatGPT. Obviously, it's hoovered up lots of data on the free version from 2021. And the biases that sit in that data will have a ripple effect, not just today, but for future generations. And what sort of data then it is accessing? So it's probably been accessing the stuff that is more in the open space, because obviously there's the shared space where they're not going to have access. So if I just talk you through the data spectrum, just thinking about that, what data is out there today. So closed data on the left-hand side will be, you know, like your internal employee records, that you're not going to be sharing those outside. Then you've got your shared group-based access. So they could be like for medical research or in a research environment where actually there's reasons why you can't share them more broadly, but actually it's beneficial to share them on a restricted basis. And then through to your open data, and that could be the things that are powering, like, you know, your easy City Mapper app, through the Transport for London's data on the latest train services or bus services. That means that you can use that to navigate around. So the data spectrum is interesting when you're considering this, because actually, depending on the data that's out there and being used, it can impact then on the biases that are translated through to society. So for the ODI, we talk about, oops, sorry, I'm just moving it really quick. We talk about our theory of change. So a key part of this in the ODI fulfilling its mission is the awareness of where we currently store, use and share data in society. So in our theory of change, we describe the future we want, and that's what's needed to make it happen. And you can see in this, the goal is for positive impact from data that is shared throughout society, and we call that the farmland future. And in an ideal world, the value is created by three groups of actors working together within the ecosystem. So those stewarding the data, those creating information and products from the data, and those making decisions informed by the multiple sources out there today. So they're the groups that come together. However, we've identified that actually there's some threats to that on both sides. So you can see that on the first side is about data hoarding, where data is treated as a commodity like oil. And obviously we don't endorse that saying data is not oil. So we definitely won't want to be thinking about that. But that means the value is only realised by a few organisations, which then increases inequality in the access and limits the social value for data. So to counter that, we believe that data should be more open and that opportunities and benefits should be more widely distributed. So this is about bringing out some of that equity we were just thinking about in D&I. And that openness comes from more open data infrastructure, such as open standards and open source technologies, and increasing the capabilities that people are more data literate and driving that future innovation. The other side, on the left-hand side, then, is data fearing, and this impacts on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in response to like data breaches, like scandals like Cambridge Analytica, you might get more fear from people in society. You know, they've got legitimate concerns based on what they're seeing happening. So this could prompt individuals, though, to withdraw access to data, which in turn could prevent the individual and society from realising the benefits. And that in itself could contribute to more of the biases and gaps in the data that we rely on. So to counter this, we believe that we need to build in trust into the ecosystem, which comes from better engagement between data providers, users, collectors, policymakers, and other stakeholders. And it comes from ensuring a more equitable approach to data where benefits are more widely distributed. And of course, this comes down to thinking about ethics and the activity when we're accessing, using and sharing data. So I'll come on to a bit more about that too. So why should we care about diversity challenges and biases in data? So I'm just going to run through some examples. But first, I just wanted to draw your attention to the data life cycle. So many of you will be familiar with the data life cycle, but I think we often forget when we're thinking about biases that where they come from at the stage, and actually they can be introduced at every stage, from the creation, the storage, the use, the sharing, the archive, and the destroying. So it's really important that when we think about the biases in data and how we treat it, we actually consider the entire life cycle, because sometimes the way you've created the data can really have the biggest knock-on effects in the use. And if we're thinking about a world where we're using algorithms, obviously algorithms just amplify the bias and make it worse. So I think one key thing is really think about that data life cycle when we're going through. So any talk wouldn't be right without the scare stories of where things have gone wrong. So this is I'll just go through now some of the examples here. So this one is from a BBC article that you may have seen from the work from the Home Office. And it reports that the UK Home Office passport checker was biased against dark-skinned women. So what they found was that dark-skinned women were told that their photos were of poor quality 22% of the time, while the figure for light-skinned women was only 14%. And then dark-skinned men were told that their photos were poor quality 15% of the time, while the figure for light-skinned men was only 9%. So the photos of the women with the darkest skin were 4 times more likely to be graded poor quality than women with the lightest skin. So this is interesting because actually this was in the use that this bias came out, but actually it was the input data that was the issue. So the training data set was less representative of women and of people of colour. And this produced a system then that doesn't work for those groups of people. So you can see there that actually that input data had that really big impact on those groups and how they could use the data, which is disappointing to see that happen and go through. So the next one. In 2018, large global firms like Admiral and Marks and Sparks faced public backlash when the Sun newspaper found that insurance quotes for drivers with traditional names like John were far lower than quotes for the same for drivers named Mohammed. And it was up to almost £1,000 different and almost double. So this was down again to the data being used to train the algorithm being biased and unrepresentative of the communities which it was serving. And this led then to the unethical outcomes and negative impacts. You know, whether or not the Sun story that was there turns out to be totally accurate, you can see the discriminatory nature of insurance is well documented. And as a matter of routine, insurance companies consider the postcodes and crime rates of motorists when deciding on policy rates. So in short, those living in impoverished areas are likely to pay a higher premium for their insurance, regardless of how frequently they claim on their policies. So these algorithms can have the ability to be dangerously discriminatory and contribute to both structural racism and a poverty premium that increases inequality. So the next one. So when we think about this one's interesting because everybody's heard of Cambridge Analytica, I should imagine by now, where Facebook users were paid to use a personality test app, and their app gained access to data about users and about their friends, which was sold to Cambridge Analytica. And they were used to provide analytical assistance to the 2016 presidential campaign of Ted Cruz and Donald Trump. And then in 2019, Facebook agreed to pay £500,000 fine to the UK Information Commissioner's Office for exposing the data of its users to serious risk of harm. So in May 2018, obviously, Cambridge Analytica filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, and that was one where the laws were in place. But there's a difference here between data ethics and data protection. So you can see from this one, actually, what they were doing here was from data protection, it was illegal what they were doing. So actually they were able to be caught under the Data Protection Act, but it also comes down to ethics as well. And how does that impact on people and that ethical question? And we'll come on to a little bit more about ethics in a moment. So this one's quite an interesting one, if anybody, when you think about creating data. So this one's interesting because Peter Colvin, a professor of UC San Diego and a clinician of the VA hospital, was working on consumer wearables on a sleep study. And he began noticing discrepancy in the data being collected. So he found higher error rates regarding certain subjects of whom were all African American. So despite copious evidence of accuracy issues for darker skin types, hardly any research or action was taken to address the problem. So most of us wear fitness trackers. I know I certainly do. And most fitness trackers available to today's market employ the use of, and I could really struggle saying this word, so the photophysiographic, green light basically signaling to monitor heart rate. And if you look at if you take your watch off, you'll see the green light sensors, which can be seen at the back of the devices. They continuously emit light in the skin to the wearer, and they're penetrating the skin layer, so tracking the amount of light absorbed or reflected back to the chart, to the rise or fall of the blood volume in the arteries and the estimated heart rate and energy expenditure. So the green light sensors, the PPG sensors, are common in consumer devices because they're cheaper and less sensitive to motion errors like infrared lights are, which are used normally in medical hospital grade trackers. But the green light, a shorter wavelength, mean it's more susceptible to being absorbed by melanin, making it harder to be accurate or reading in individuals with darker skin tones with more melanin. So it's interesting that that these have become the norm, but actually there's an inherent bias in them in the data that's collected. So why did they become so prevalent? So first of all, the big companies take the quickest and easiest approach to the market. So they were just saying, is it cheap? Is it readable? Then they went to market. The second part was that they were using the data they were using, they had access to, was from Silicon Valley. And obviously that's heavily white data from people who have obviously less melanin. So you're not getting the full diversity of the American culture there. And lastly, it was the question of how you classify skin tone. And historically, scientists were using the Fitzpatrick skin type scale, which was developed over 50 years ago and hasn't been updated. So you could see a number of things that were coming in there that caused those issues here with that collection of data. And the next one I just wanted to talk about on this one was Open Active. So for any of you who haven't heard of Tanya, she's amazing. I did a podcast with her recently, so if you've not seen that, you should look it up. It's really good. So Sports England Active Lives adult survey in November 2021 report found that 17.6 million, or it's about 39%-ish of adults in England are not getting the benefits of regular activity. And there's still just under 2% fewer adults than those that do less than the required 150 minutes of activities a week. And 2.6% or more inactive adults that are doing less than 30 minutes activity a week. So Open Active is a major open data initiative that enables the publishing of standardized open data on physical activities to promote innovation, to make it easier to find and book these activities online. So you need high quality data to be able to find those physical activities. Now, post-pandemic, there's been a disproportionate impact on the activity levels among marginalized demographics, such as children, young people, older people, women, and people with disabilities. And this exacerbates the inequalities, and addressing these inequalities is needed more than ever now, we believe, to make it easy for people to find those opportunities. So when I spoke to Tanya, it was brilliant speaking to her, and she as a Paralympian, she was para archer who competed for Great Britain in 2014 until her retirement for international sports. And she discovered archery while she was a patient at Stoke Mandeville Hospital after a road traffic accident. So she went one day from being able-bodied to the next day not being able to move from halfway down her body down. So she was great that she got access to trying out archery. But what she found was that she discovered numerous challenges when she tried to find a club that could account for her needs. So her first experience was that the limitations of being disabled would present, so they wouldn't cater for her. So what do you want to do? Can you imagine if you wanted to go swimming, you want to not just find out where your nearest pool is, but you need to find out whether you can actually park there, whether you can get your wheelchair in there, whether they've got a winch that can get you into the pool. And it was the same for archery. She needed to find out whether she could actually get to the archery ground. Was there gravel that she couldn't get a wheelchair over? Was there a toilet that was accessible for her to use, or would she have to drive home, which she did in some cases? There's also sorts of things that are in there that are challenges and barriers to participation, which means that people with disabilities are then shut out of some of those experiences that every one of us takes for granted. And the Activity Alliance annual disability and activity survey in 2022 showed that only 4 in 10 disabled people feel they could be as active as they wanted to, in contrast to 7 of 10 non-disabled people. And there were numerous reasons for the difficulty. And this would go from the relevant information and those providers providing that information and understanding. So Open Active was one of the things that the ODI is working on, where it's looking to update the standard that the leisure centres and others are sending out to include information that would be helpful to people with those disabilities. So they don't have to do that phone call. That information could be readily available to them at their fingertips. So that's quite a quick canter through some of the examples. So what can we do about it? And what does it come down to? So I always love this saying that trust builds gradually over time, but can plummet in a day. So I think getting these things right just shows how important it is. So let's look at some of these things then as practitioners, how we can get those right. So first of all, let's start with data ethics. So what is data ethics? And often there's lots of confusion with data ethics, with data protection. And I always like to think about it as, everyone takes the mick out of me for my analogies, but it's like an ice cube. So like data protection is the law, it's the hard bit of the ice cube, but you've got the melt around the outside, but actually isn't the law. And that's the bit where actually there's judgments involved. And that's where your data ethics is. It's around that melt around the outside. So it's a branch of ethics that evaluates the practices with the potential to adverse people and society in the data collection, sharing and use. And often sometimes with data ethics, it might be that things that are ethical implications then suddenly become law as society responds to those things. So that just gives you just a bit of a flavour when we're thinking about data ethics and how it can help in this area. And it's handy to look about what actually makes up trustworthy data stewardships for all of us, those of us that are handling data. All of the things actually make that up. So you can see here, you've got your legal standing, your privacy, your security at level 1. So all those things that the must do that people are pretty good at normally doing. But then when you start to build up the level 2, you need the skills and knowledge too. There's a lot of focus on quality and accuracy, but actually that level 3, ethics and transparency, is just as important. And a really important factor there is also engagement and accountability, because what you really want to make sure is you've got active and positive impact from what you're doing. And why is that important? Well, it comes back down to trust, really. So we did this survey back in 2019. So nearly 9 out of 10 people, so 87%, feel it's important, very important, that organisations that interact with use data about them ethically. So 59% of people trust the NHS and healthcare providers to use personal data ethically, and they were the only type of organisation trusted by half of those surveys. Falling below the mark were central government and local government. But 44% of people felt that government and regulators should be most responsible for making sure personal data about them handled is ethically done. And it's always interesting for me to see how low social media is in this, but still many people share data with them. So it really gives you some of the attitudes of British adults towards the efficacy and the use of their personal data. So let's look at the practical tips then and things that we can do if we are starting a project or starting to think about this. So the first one, for those of you who haven't seen it, there is online the data ethics canvas. I always say this is similar to the data protection impact assessment. So before you're starting a piece of work, you do your DPIA. So actually you should also do your data ethics canvas. So I'm going to take you through the different sections of these because each of the colours mean something different. So I'll just take you through each of the sections here. And of course, they've started drilling outside, which is always great. So the first section is about the data. So when you're going through your data ethics canvas, you'll look very at the beginning at the data. And this starts with, what do you know about your data? Are there any limitations from it? Who collects it? What rights do you have over it? So you can see straight away from some of the things we've described in the use that actually, if you've not got your diverse sample set, then when you use your data, there's going to be a problem with it. And it's about understanding that. There's also an argument that actually you can't get to a stage where all data, well, it's probably all data is biased in some way, but it's understand the limitations that is really important here and the impacts it can have. So data is your first one. So looking at your data sources, your rights around them, your limitations, and your ethical and legislative context for it. The next one is about impact. And that's the impact we want to have, both positive and negative on society. So thinking about in those terms. And we may not always realise the consequences of our work in the UK, but we just want to make sure that people are thinking it through. So I think impact's a really important one. And I think at the moment it's interesting seeing all the discussion around ChatGPT. It's focusing quite a lot on the negative. Actually, there's lots of positive uses, but it's getting that balance, isn't it, and understanding. So the next section here is about engagement. How do we engage with people? How do we make sure the people actually, when we talked originally about our theory of change, the people that might not want to share their data because they're scared about it, adding to the bias and then inequity, how do we make sure we communicate in a way that actually means that they would be willing to put their data in, that actually we're getting that balance through? So yeah, that's a really important one about that, how you engage with people, those communities, the openness and transparency, and then sharing data with others. And the very last section on this is about the processes. So what systems or training is required, and how often do you review them, and what are your actions? So do you have trained professionals in your organizations making these decisions? Do you review those systems? And there are all sorts of things that you can consider here. So that's one thing to use when you're thinking about having a little look at your project and just trying to help yourself consider your the different ethical concerns and the impacts they'll have. The other one that you can start thinking about is about a data ethics maturity model. So one of the things you can also find on the ODI website is our data ethics maturity model. So this doesn't take it from a project, this takes it to an organization, and it breaks it down into those 6 areas you see there. And this talks about how mature you are when you're considering these sorts of things. So obviously you'll be looking at the various aspects here. And your first one will be your organizational governance and oversight. So what processes and groups have you got in place? Your next one, you'll be thinking about skills and knowledge. So it highlights the steps required by a culture where ethical data practices are embedded by identifying the knowledge sharing, training and learning required by your organization. The next one talks about your data management processes and the risks in there. So what are your key business processes that underpin ethical collection, use and sharing of data, focused on identifying, assessing them and the harms to individuals and communities? The next one then is thinking about funding and procurement. So highlights the need for organisations to invest in embedding ethical data practices and to reflect the requirements in the procurement processes. Then you've got your stakeholder and staff engagement to address the need for organisations to engage both with communities reflected in or impacted by the data you're collecting, using or sharing, and doing so in a way that is understandable. And the last one then is about the legal standard and compliance. So this reflects the need for organisations to abide by the relevant laws, regulations and social norms to avoid those harmful impacts from collection, use and sharing. But it's really about building a culture of data ethics to ensure that people have an appreciation of the ethical impacts of collection, use and sharing of data across that life cycle we started with, embedding those into the norms and behaviours of the organisation to help you demonstrate the trustworthiness with data and how the data is handled. And it's also about having the engaged staff and customers and stakeholders to increase the likelihood of the positive impact and decrease the unintended risks or harms to people and communities. So the next one that we'll go on to is then something that is we've got coming up. And this is about the data assurance. So we've got the data ethics canvas, which is a project, your data maturity risk assessment, which is about an organisation and measuring where you are. And then this one is a new one that we're just working on at the moment, which is about data assurance. And data assurance, we say, is about a process or a set of processes that can increase confidence that data will meet a specific need, or the organisation collecting, assessing and sharing that data are doing so in trustworthy ways. And this is about how we can demonstrate this to others. So at the moment, we're looking, and we're just doing some research, user research next week on a code of conduct for organisations. So how can you show to others that you're meeting a certain standards? We're working on this standard right now, so we can demonstrate to others that there are certain principles that you will abide to. That means that actually you're looking at all those different factors we've just been speaking about. And the other one is, how do you tell the data set that you are using contains biases, doesn't contain biases, has been assured. So we're also looking at what makes up assurance for that data set checklist as well. And we'll be working with the community to feed into the results on that and what that looks like. So that's coming soon, and that will be done by the end of the year. So definitely watch this space for more on data assurance and what that looks like. Because really, this comes down to doing trust and doing the right thing. So many businesses may say, well, why should I do this? Well, actually, it's the right thing to do. And I think the organisations doing well really understand the challenges and the diversity challenges in biases in data collection, use and sharing, and make sure they have got those responsible practices, because actually it's about doing the right thing, but actually the diversity of teams, of data, it ends up having the better outcomes overall. And that's what lots of the research shows. And that also then links into the reputation of the companies that are doing this well. So that was a really quick counter for me. More than happy for you to contact me if you'd like more information from the ODI and the work we're doing, and we'd love to hear from you. So I'll stop sharing now and we can take some questions.
Thanks so much, Lisa, for that really interesting run through. And we certainly had some shocked faces coming up on the reactions when you were talking about some of those sort of high profile cases, but really interesting to see some of the frameworks that people can start to use in their organizations to take the bias out of data and improve all of those decisions we're making. So we've got some questions coming into the Q&A. If anybody's got any more, feel free to drop those into the Q&A tab and we'll work through those. So as a starting point, Lisa, you talked about the data lifecycle, and we've got a question here in terms of, should the data lifecycle include the plan, design and enable stages as well? And how would you advise people on building EDI into the front of all of their data projects and products?
Yeah, definitely. I always think it starts with a plan. So that for me is in that create stage, but you do need to design it. So I'd say, like, because I used to look after, when I was at Ordnance Survey, I used to look after the data management requirements team. And it was so often that people would skip the data management requirements team and go straight to the data architects and ask them to build something. That's like going to your builder, build me a house, and not telling them that you want a bungalow, you want a flat, how many windows you want, if you want doors. You need to have that planning when you're creating it straight at the front. So I think it's really thinking about it in that way, that if you are creating any of your data sets, then you need to be thinking through this, and you need to be thinking about the data you want, because sometimes in the creation, it might be actually you're going to be acquiring other people's data. If that's the case, then you need to be asking what biases they have, what specification they've used, and start thinking it through. I think it's at that point you really need those diverse teams in there too, because actually I always find it fascinating. I've got 2 boys, they're 17 and they're both 6 foot. And I keep asking them to help me around the kitchen. And one of them just said to me, "Why's the kitchen designed for men?" I was like, "I don't know. That's a really good point." So, having those different perspectives from those different viewpoints, that's when you start getting the real benefits to everybody. So yeah, just starting off with that planning is definitely what you want to do, and the requirements that you need, and asking the questions with the diverse teams.
Great, thank you. And I think you've talked about some of the kind of challenges in how organizations and businesses do that. What would you do when you've got a boss who basically says that you're GDPR compliant as a business, and that's fine, and doesn't sort of think about that broader elements in terms of the data stewardship and ethics?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, doing GDPR shouldn't just be, yeah, we're fine, that's it, we've ticked the box, we are done. Because actually it depends where you want to sit as brand, as your company. How does it impact on your bottom line and your customers, actually, if you were caught out with reputation? So I'm always one for stories. So if you do think there's some of your practices that can be improved, don't get your stories from your own organisation. Get stories from other organisations where there's been probably some media coverage about it, and bring them back in to show the senior leadership that actually what has happened elsewhere, and then go, it couldn't happen here, could it? It's about trying to influence them so they understand. Sometimes they won't really see the consequence in. I mean, it's only when you've been in those situations, I think, that you realise the impact. I mean, I'm also fascinated when I go on the London Underground. If anybody's been on the tube map, when you look at the lack of wheelchair accessibility, you just think that it's just hideous. And so if we all had a day where we had to go run the London Underground in a wheelchair, suddenly our eyes would be open to how difficult it is and how many places we couldn't get to, which is not right. So I think it's about trying to get people to understand and walk in other shoes. Any way you can do that, I think, is a bonus to try and get that. And it comes back then for the data and the planning and what you're creating and using, and then how it impacts on your business, because it does impact on the bottom line. So, senior managers should care about that.
Great, thank you. And quite a lot of the bias that we've been talking about is in sort of minoritized groups where there's perhaps been a history of surveillance or discrimination. And those groups have a very good reason to be quite wary in terms of sharing their data. How do we address that underrepresentation for people who are wary about the data sharing in our data sets?
It's a really difficult one, isn't it? Because you can see how this plays out. I mean, that you may get a high crime area, and that'll be an area maybe social deprivation, but actually what happens is you get more reporting from that area, so then it's more flagged, and actually there's more concentration. So sometimes I think it's about working with some of those organisations that are in there, especially the police and others. Like we do a certified data ethics professional course where getting people trained up to understand that. So I think there's a responsibility for those that are working in government and organisations that are using the data or collecting the data to really start having that conversation, because that's definitely been the case in the past, that there's almost perverse outcomes by that and by the targeting. So you can see why there's reticence from people not wanting to put any more data into that. But then it's got to be about the communication and engagement. But I think it's got to be about the communities coming together and working it through, because I think without that, then I think it's very difficult to do. But you want to encourage it, don't you? How can you do that in a way that actually means that you're getting that data, but without getting the bias? Yeah, it's not an easy one. I think it's going to take quite a lot of people to understand and be in this space and work together on it. And it's going to take people from different sides, different perspectives to come together.
I'm sort of thinking about that from a slightly different point of view, in terms of not necessarily being wary about sharing data, but we've got a question here that sort of talks about ensuring that you've got the diversity of thought, but sometimes the younger people perhaps face a barrier or perhaps lack confidence to share their ideas when they're starting out in their career. And what advice would you give to sort of the Gen Z group in terms of sharing their voice?
Yeah, it should never be that they feel that, should it? It's amazing that even gets there. I mean, I've had it before that when I've been in a situation where somebody, I've said something and then it's been all mailroom, and then a man said what I've said. I was ignored, but he was listened to. So that was really interesting for me. They call it heap-eating, don't they? And for young people, actually, you need ambassadors in the room. So if you are somebody who sits in the room and there's somebody with, who's the young voice in the room who's got it, we've got to have that inclusion side of things, that everybody's got a right to speak and there's no silly ideas. So if you are there and you're in a position of power, then I'd encourage those people to be amplifying and lifting up those. So if you're the younger person in the room that has it, don't be afraid to speak, to say it. And it might be actually, you might want to do some influencing before you go in there. Because it might be that you can feed back if you have felt like that in situations. It might be that you can feed back to somebody in the room and just say, I've got these ideas, can you help bring me in? So I think it's on two sides. There's a responsibility to those who are in the room, who are more senior, to listen to everybody and have the inclusion and amplify those people that are in the room. And there's also then for people coming in, you know, the younger people, have the confidence to speak up, do some maneuvering beforehand. So if you do feel like you've not been listened to, then reflect on that and see if there's other people that can help you be that ambassador in the room too, because actually everybody's voice should be listened to.
I think it's really important, isn't it, making sure that people's voices get into the room and into the conversation. We've got a couple of questions here around sort of the use of data that has perhaps compounded social inequality, and also how do we make sure that those who are impacted by projects or products are in the representative samples that are being used. So how do we make sure that sort of aspect of diversity when we're using data?
I think some of it's about the teams that start collecting the data at the beginning. It was interesting. There was one example of the Indigenous community in, I think it was Canada or America, and Google were putting it on their maps, and they didn't engage with those communities. So when they produced the maps, there was areas that were missing, which then really, even you think about all the history and the stuff that went on in America, that it really led to ill feeling. But actually, all they had to do in those early stages was engage with the communities and start, start that conversation. So I think it's about the teams that are collecting that information at the very beginning. If you haven't got the diversity, you need to be looking to others to help you and to inform you. So I think it's just knowing that you've got gaps and asking the questions. Because I think if you just blunder through, because a lot of these things end up as unintended consequences, don't they? Nobody comes to work to do a bad job, but actually they can have really serious impacts on people. So I think it's just asking the questions. So that engagement part of the data ethics canvas is really important at that early stage, about just thinking about where the blind spots are, because we all have them. Because we're all made up of the stories we tell ourselves and the experiences we have. So it's just about that engagement really early on.
Talking about the sort of data ethics framework, I'm sure the ODI works quite a lot with a number of good actors who deal with data in a responsible way. Do you have a feel as to whether data ethics is a conversation that has gone mainstream, or whether it's a conversation that is being had by a small number of good actors in this area?
Do you know, I spent the last 2 days at the AI Summit, and it was amazing to see the number of companies that were talking about data ethics. And it wasn't all just the normal suspects. There was a lot more organizations that were talking about it. So I think for me, I think we're on that tipping point now. I think it's definitely pushing through. I think the next generation, the Gen Z and others, they really care about this stuff, and they're right. We're all right to do so. So I think we're challenging those perspectives. So yeah, just my experience in the last two days, I think it's really interesting to see, and it's not just your normal suspects. So I think we're going mainstream.
That's really encouraging to hear, isn't it? And how do you train people in terms of data ethics, and perhaps using the data ethics canvas that you talked about in a practical way?
Yeah, so we've got a couple of bits. So we can either do consultancy, we help organisations out. So if they want help with the canvas themselves, then we can offer some consultancy and help. Or on our certified data ethics course that we run, actually each of the people on there, you'll get a cohort with people from different organisations. And obviously it's Chatham House rules, but you'll be sharing with that cohort and sharing examples of real life. So it can be quite interesting if you get the case studies from other organisations, because then you start getting the viewpoints from how they work too. And then you can start getting a broader perspective and the different ethical challenges that each of us face. So yeah, there's a number of ways of doing that. But it's important, isn't it? I mean, it's really nice at the ODI. One of the first things, not only did I have to do my GDPR training when I joined a few years ago, but I had to do my data ethics training. So it's a mandatory thing that when you come into the organisation, you do that. So I think it really helps us all think about it. It's, one of those mandatory things that we all should do.
It's so important, isn't it? I think ethics in general, but then ethics in data and ethics in AI is becoming much more of a topic of conversation as well. So we've answered so far all of the questions in the Q&A, so there is still some time. So if you've got a question, do feel free to drop it into the Q&A tab. But whilst people have that last thought on questions, one from me, if you could say one thing that you'd ask people to take away from today's session, Lisa, what would it be?
Oh, where would I start? There's always so many. I think it's just to ask yourself that question: are you being inclusive? What more could you do? I think you start from that, because yeah, I think it can be, there's lots of training and things you can do, but I think it's about what you can do and how you can see those different people's worlds, because actually there's very different perspectives out there, and when you start getting exposure to it, then I think that's when it starts becoming a real benefit, that you can understand those different things, and it just makes it much richer. Your data would be much richer in the benefits. So I'd start with yourself, having a little look. I'm obviously a big fan. If you want to listen to Tanya's podcast on the ODI, that was amazing. So it's always really good to give you that, how she was treated differently. You know, from her perspective, she went from somebody who could walk one day and somebody who couldn't next, and even how she was treated where it came to she was when she was in her Paralympian uniform, they treated her with respect. And then when she wasn't in her Paralympian uniform, that people would ask her, "Do you work?" She's like, "Well, I'm in a wheelchair. It doesn't mean that my hands don't work." And so there's all different perspectives. So hearing those sorts of perspectives is really interesting, just to change the way you think about things, to make sure you're getting that broad understanding.
Great, thank you. Good tip for the podcast, one for everyone to listen to. We've got a question that has come in here, talking about how people can gain confidence to speak up about unethical matters, particularly if they're in the early stages of their career and they've got they're a young manager sort of working in an operational team. How do you approach that with leadership?
Yeah, well, you'd really hope you've got policies in place, like the whistleblowing policy and things like that, wouldn't you, to start with? I think it's about how you can bring almost, because sometimes it could be quite threatening. And what you don't want to do is have young people dismissed, because actually, it sounds corny, but the younger generation are the future of the workforce, and things are changing. Culturally, things are changing. So how can you bring wider thoughts in, wider learning? I mean, I'm always one for snaffling podcasts and other materials that I try and share internally. How can you try and shift the dynamic and give that broader viewpoint to the organisation, which means that when you do raise those issues, if you haven't got those policies that are working well, that they start to land. And it might be the case that some organisations it won't land. And I think that there's that too. There is going to be that. But what can you do to influence, try to change, try to cajole? Because actually people should be listening, but if they're not, then you can see if you can do something about it. And if you can't, then I think they did right there by having to move on.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. Well, I think we've answered the question, so we can leave it there from today. Thank you so much to Lisa for coming along, your presentation, and answering all of those questions that people had. We've got one last session of the conference this afternoon, which is a panel that I'll be hosting that Lisa's also joining. And we've got a couple of other speakers from earlier in the week joining us on that panel as well. So please do dial in at 4 o'clock for the last part of the conference and to hear some of the reflections of all the interesting topics that we've heard from our range of speakers over the week. But that is us for this morning. And Lisa, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.